Hello students, I'm back again. Um, this video is placed on Moodle right below an interview with the playwright Arthur Miller, who wrote Death of a Salesman, about his own work. And surely an author is a leading expert on his own work. He points in the interview to the changing meaning of Death of a Salesman, particularly when it's examined by people of other cultures. I've included an Indian university lecture as also a perspective on this play, which has had an international resonance, as many of us feel eaten up by forces larger than ourselves, and struggle with what it means to be an individual, which are themes in the play. Nevertheless, the play is set in Brooklyn, and the play is set at a certain time. And something that Arthur Miller skirts over in his interview is the depth of the controversy associated with this play and some others that he wrote. He was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee as a communist that was seen as an American enemy. And he had to justify himself, and was for a good decade and a half of his career blacklisted, meaning that nobody would make a film of him in Hollywood, and he could not make television shows. And if people wanted to produce his plays, they were afraid to do so because they were afraid of even losing the backers for shows that he might produce based on the accusations of communism. The truth was that Arthur Miller, for a time, did attend communist meetings. He neither confirmed nor denied this, as I recall, in the House on Activities Committee. But I'm in a position to actually know he really quite probably did. Why? I need to say first, I am not a communist. Let me be very clear. I am not a communist. But for a time, my grandmother was a communist in Brooklyn. And it would seem that the family knew Miller and the people who were in the original cast of Death of a Salesman. My family did. The son of the man who played Willy Loman in the first production in New York City was the best man at my uncle's wedding. And the committee had accused Arthur Miller of attending uh, meetings on Schermerhorn Street in Brooklyn, and members of my family lived nearby there. My grandmother renounced the Communist Party and all it stood for um, after it was made public the atrocities that Joseph Stalin had committed during the Second World War and before. She had initially dismissed that as fake news, but ultimately realized that by agreeing with the party, she had been supporting human rights violations, and she had wanted, like so many other Americans who had joined the Communist Party, to make America a nicer place, a better place to live. And Arthur Miller, when reflecting on the accusations against him of communism, said he was willing to leave the country in order to keep writing if need be, but that he didn't really want to leave because he truly loves this country, or loved this country. And that was true for my family as well. So we're going to examine this really big controversy to which I have just disclosed a secondhand, I'm 2 degrees of separation from this national controversy. Arthur Miller's work as is it subversive and somehow fundamentally un-American? I would say no, and so would the people who attended his plays. And so I'm examining Death of a Salesman in the context of an abundance of Marxist American discourse. There was a ton of it, and I just am going to tell you about it. Again, I say I am not a Marxist. I am not a communist, but it would be irresponsible for me to ignore this as part of your understanding of what happened in the 20th century in the arts. People like William Faulkner, who was terribly conservative, wrote in the 20th century, but so did some other people, both North and South, who embraced a conversation about workers' rights that sometimes veered toward Marxism. Um, and then there is a discussion then of the Federal Theater Project, which happened in the 1930s and 40s, and Brechtian and Cold War constructions of alienation. I'll explain what that means in a bit. Death of a Salesman. And I put here success, followed by subpoenas, a word you're hearing in the news. Death of a Salesman is produced in 1949. It wins the Pulitzer Prize for Drama that year. To say it was an overnight success, it was a huge success. It is hard not to have a sense of great success around this play. On the contrary, it was a phenomenon. It was, a breakout hit. And Brooks Atkinson of the New York Times, who didn't like much theater he saw, said, by common consent, this is one of the finest dramas in the whole range of American theater. In other words, it's the best of the best. And this is the playwright and director of the work, Arthur Miller, who is on the right, and Elia Kazan, who also directed the Streetcar Named Desire production that I asked you to take a look at in film. Really good film. And they were like the toast of New York that year. They were the stars of the city. But only a few years later, both men are investigated by Congress and face the possibility of jail, blacklisting, or even possible deportation. And so why? Why were these men investigated by the government? If they were communists, why would this even matter? Why aren't people allowed to have all kinds of political opinions legally in the United States? Spoiler alert, they are, but people were convinced that communists were a particular class of people who presented a clear and present threat. And why would anyone in theater or other arts become a communist? Why would my grandma become a communist? I have some personal answers for you about this. Why would any Americans in the 1930s and early 1940s have been interested in joining the Communist Party? It doesn't make sense from where we sit now, perhaps. And again, I want to say this yet again, I am not a communist. But I want you to understand what was going on here. And so this is a short history of the American worker and the multiple deaths and degradations of guys and gals like Willy Loman. Willy Loman was recognizable to his initial audience in New York. The reason why people loved this play to a large extent was because they understood what Willy Loman was struggling with. And I just want to talk to you about the Great Depression. 25% of adult Americans didn't have a job, which basically meant that approximately 50% of households, because most households were one income families where the woman would not work outside the home, were near starving after the stock market crashed in 1929, or very close to it. If you had a government job, you were okay. And some people had the ability to survive in their own business, but it was really quite hard. Farmers struggled. Just so many people struggled. 1 in 4 men who were heads of household had no job and no job prospects, which meant that at least 1/4 of American families really might have starved. And there was no safety net. In other words, today you could get on food stamps. There were no food stamps. Social Security, what's that? You know, grandma's going to starve too. And even his New Deal took years to really get underway. So capitalism seemed to have failed because people weren't just looking for a job that didn't exist. They were looking for food. Um, and there was a history of work in America, and you may not have heard this before, and I want to talk to you about this. Here's what that history looked like. Let me describe to you what you are looking at. The man who is standing here all by himself in what looks like practically a boxer's ring is not a boxer. He's the mayor of a town. And everyone surrounding him with those hats on all around, they're not here to watch a prize fight. They are here because they have no work and they're asking the mayor to tell them how they're going to feed their families. This photo was taken in 1932. It's the mayor of Seattle addressing a gathering of unemployed men desperate for work with like starving kids. If you just look at the size of the city government versus the size of the people, group of people who were about to collapse from hunger, to lose their homes, to do all of this, people who had jobs who through forces greater than their own selves had lost the work because everyone was out of work in the crash. This looked like a dangerous situation. What's remarkable is not that people thought about the possibility of a revolt against the government to try to set up a new system where everyone could eat, but that it didn't happen in this environment. They had enough trust in the community and the government not to do that. This mayor, I wonder if he feared for his life that day. I don't know. But remarkably, Seattle had no revolt, although the government was vastly outnumbered by its starving citizens. In A People's History of the United States, writing about American labor history, Zinn writes, in Seattle, the Fishermen's Union caught fish and exchanged them with people who picked fruit and vegetables. And those who cut wood exchanged that. There were 22 locals, meaning branches of a union, each with a commissary where food and firewood were exchanged for other goods and services. Barbers, seamstresses, and doctors gave of their skills in exchange for other things. But by 1933, the exchange system seemed to have collapsed. So that worked for a while. You could go out and fish or grow apples and trade stuff, but after a while that wasn't enough because some things in a modern economy really do demand money. You can't pay your mortgage in apples. And it was at about this point that tension seemed to rise to a breaking point. Be surprised if this was not in your high school history class. There was a trucker strike in 1934. This is a picture of it on the right. Those are cops beating up truckers who won't deliver goods without getting paid. That's what that's a picture of. And the cops would also come in and kill people and wound them. The Haymarket riot of 1886 was another incident where the cops killed people who were just asking for a living wage. And throughout this period, from like the 1880s to the 1940s, socialism, communism, and Marxist constructions of other kinds were seriously discussed by many Americans as a solution to this problem. Again, I want to say I am not a communist, nor have I ever been. Look at these guys. They were known as Pinkertons. They have badges, right, and guns. They're not cops. These guys are hanging out so that they won't let people who are asking for better wages who work streetcars, that they can't get near where the streetcars are. Um, and the police would often refuse, to their credit, to kill workers on strike. But many industrialists, like Andrew Carnegie, hired and armed their own private armies, their own private militias, often using people hired from a company called Pinkerton's National Detective Agency, which, by the way, still exists, to both harass lawfully striking workers, people who are not breaking the law, were just holding up signs peacefully saying they wanted better wages, and their families, and even their children. And in many instances, these private guards shot and killed women and children. No joke. Look at that guy with a gun. Does he look like a guy who, under no circumstances, would kill a woman and a child if his boss told him to? I wouldn't trust him with women and children in that gun. Here they are, more Pinkertons. They are harassing the wives of strikers. This was an illustration that appeared in the newspaper in 1884 of the Pinkertons harassing striking coal miners' wives in Ohio. You probably have never heard of this guy, Eugene V. Debs, but he won more than 1 million votes when he ran for president. He was in jail during the 1912 presidential election, basically for just being a socialist who said things that people didn't like. He got 1 in 20 votes cast, despite the fact that he was in prison for helping striking workers with his words. And if he had been even able to give one single speech during the whole campaign, who knows what would have happened with that. And if this sounds like a Yankee problem, it really actually wasn't. It wasn't just urban or just northern. These are 2 young people in the 1930s striking at a textile mill in the South. And this is in Missouri. Remember the Ferguson riots? Well, the police have not always been riding tanks around Ferguson, but in St. Louis, they beat up this guy for trying to rally people at a strike. And historian Howardson writes of this period: by September 18th, 1934, the same year as the trucker strikes, 421,000 textile workers were on strike, and there were mass arrests, organizers were beaten, and over a dozen workers were killed. This was largely in the South. Many ordinary Americans felt as their needs could not be met by a business as usual American strategy. And these women are asking for equal pay for equal work on the right in the years of the 1930s. They wanted the same wage for doing the same work as a man. And here are cops, I think this is near Tompkinson Square Park in the 1930s in New York City, swinging at strikers and people who are sympathetic to strikers. Death of a Salesman is written with all of that in background, and the roots of Marxist ideas and their frustration with the situations I've just described. FDR instituted the New Deal in 1933 to combat this unrest. In fact, these were all very moderate plans for a time with extreme hazards to the country altogether. Most of the New Deal programs were industrial. The Public Works Administration and I'm sorry, it's not National Rifle Association, the National Recovery Act is what the NRA stands for here. And these were to help get people back to work with things like building roads and bridges and schools and post offices, and also to help businesses get back on their feet. Um, and but many too were ruled. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought hydroelectric power to the south, and the CCC was a way to help people work on things like preventing wildfires in the national parks, building roads in rural communities, clearing up after any kind of bad weather. Park rangers and members of the Department of Forestry were involved in administrating the CCC. But there were also artistic plans within the New Deal. The New Deal was a very sweeping set of programs. The art of the New Deal honored American workers. Look at these paintings that were paid for as part of the PWA's buildings. They would pay visual artists to paint on the walls of the post offices and the schools and such, and train stations, and also Coit Tower in San Francisco. These were murals that were detailed about American workers doing things like building dams. Some of this work, though not all of it, was overt. And here were some other non-government funded works of art, non-government funded from this period, and had some Marxist overtones. A Southern writer named Carson McCullers, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter is a book that's made me cry the hardest of all books. If you need a good cry, if you need to have a total fall on the ground wailing cry, read The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. It is unbelievably well written and unbelievably sad. Two characters in this novel are overtly Marxist. Dr. Benedict Mady Copeland is an African-American physician in the book who has come to the conclusion that socialism is the answer to racism in America, so much so he even names one of his children Karl Marx. And Jake Blount is a white labor agitator around textile mills, much like that happened in real life. There were textile mills on strike, whose ideas are less clear regarding Marxism. This is a quote that Jake Blount says: "The bastards who own these mills are millionaires. So when you walk around the streets and think about it and see hungry, worn out people and rickety-legged youngins, don't it make you mad? Don't it?" And this class doesn't include The Grapes of Wrath, but it is an important work about the problems of agriculture and capitalism. And Tom Joad, the protagonist, stands in as an everyman for the working class during the Great Depression. And here is what the author John Steinbeck said about his work in 1939. Boileau says, "The kings, gods, and heroes only were fit subjects for literature. The writer can only write about what he admires. Present-day kings aren't very inspiring. The gods are on a vacation, and about the only heroes left are the poor, and since our race admires gallantry, the writer will deal with it where he finds it. He finds it in the struggling poor now." Remember, Huckleberry Finn was neither a king or a god or a traditional hero. The Grapes of Wrath is another American novel that does not embrace traditional heroes. And this is the famous speech from the Grapes of Wrath by the protagonist, Tom Jones. And on the right is a picture of Henry Fonda, who plays him in a wonderful movie directed by John Ford, based on the book. And this is what he says, Tom Joad: "I'll be all around in the dark. I'll be everywhere, wherever you can look. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad. I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry and they know supper's ready. And when the people are eating the stuff they raise and living in the houses they build, I'll be there too. Even in dance, modern dance, the founder of it, Isadora Duncan, she created a lot of dances that looked like they came straight off a Grecian urn. But she also did a dance uh, after having spent a couple of years in the newly formed Soviet Union right after the revolution under Lenin, not Stalin. And she found her time there so inspiring, she created dances to honor the workers there. Here is a picture of some women reenacting this dance. Notice the red dresses. I've seen a performance in New York City of them doing a thing where they also dance around with a red flag. This play was written by an Irish American playwright, Eugene O'Neill. Um, and The Hairy Ape was produced in 1922, and the critics liked it quite a bit. It focuses on the life of a laborer known simply as Yank, who is exploited by the rich, imprisoned, and when he reads Marxist literature, attempts to escape. O'Neill was a member of the Communist Party for many years. And O'Neill is still celebrated as one of the great writers of the early 20th century. Um, Diego Rivera is a Marxist artist and darling of the 1930s private art collectors. Again, none of this art that I've just mentioned was paid for by the government. I want to make that explicitly clear. And truly, one of the greatest artists in the United States of all time, painter Diego Rivera, came from Mexico to paint celebrations of American industry that glorified the American worker. If you ever get a chance and you're in Michigan, go to the Detroit Institute of Art. He did a ceiling dedicated to the work of people in America in the auto industry. And I've seen the Sistine Chapel, and I've seen Diego Rivera's painting on the ceiling of the DIA. And I must tell you, I'm not sure which is the better work of art. So magnificent is Diego Rivera's work. Nelson Rockefeller commissioned Rivera, but to do some work in Rockefeller Center, but then he realized the ultimate capitalist from the ultimate capitalist family, the Rockefellers, that he didn't agree with his politics and actually destroyed the art he had commissioned despite public protests. Most people, communist or not, felt the work was beautiful and transcended daily politics. And many popular songs from this era also included communist or community-friendly themes. You've probably heard this song. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Islands, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. It was written by the man on the right named Woody Guthrie. And you'll notice that as he writes songs that have a kind of Americana folkiness to them, he has a famous sticker on his guitar that says, related to the sticker, to the guitar itself, "This machine kills fascists." And I'm not going to sing this song for you because I actually don't know the melody. I've heard it a few times. But this was popular during the Depression. They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower up to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? This was a huge, huge hit in the 1930s. And if you remember only one thing from this lecture after you finish this class, Marxist sentiments were expressed in all kinds of forms of mainstream American discourse throughout the first half of the 20th century in the United States because of working ordinary people's frustrations with the way things were going, with rich people getting richer and poor people barely able to pay their bills, if indeed they could pay them at all. Hence, the art commissioned by the New Deal, including dramatic arts, also included some. The Federal Theater Project was established by the government in 1935. Orson Welles, who is best known for his truly impressive, fabulous film, Citizen Kane. Seriously, get yourself a copy of Citizen Kane to watch. It's magnificent. If you can see it in a big theater, so much the better. Most directors that you'll ever hear interviewed will tell you Citizen Kane is the greatest film ever made. He has a group of people he works with during the Federal Theater Project or the FTP called the Mercury Theater, and they have radio shows. And they also do live productions, and this is him in 1936. And he produced a version of Shakespeare's Macbeth, but he set it in Haiti with a black cast and drummers who came from Africa. And you'll see that they were wearing masks. I'll talk about the Macbeth play in a minute, but it had problems. But it had good intentions, but problems. Well recruits the cast from his anti-capitalist era Citizen Kane from his FTP Mercury Theater players. Kane is a millionaire who runs for political office, who likes to throw really big rallies where he's kind of like this star. Just saying. The FTP production of Macbeth with a black cast was by no means racially unproblematic. It kind of fell into some stereotypes. In some runs of the show, the actor playing Macbeth was white, while all the other players were black. And the very name it was given, Voodoo Macbeth, it seems really pejorative. But at the time, particularly in Harlem where it was produced, and again, this is still during the Harlem Renaissance, the African American community sees it as a real opportunity for forays into serious theater because Orson Welles is an established and admired thinker and director by this time, and Macbeth by Shakespeare is an established play. And it was perceived by some precisely because it crossed racial divides as Marxist. In other words, the script of Macbeth doesn't change, and it's about monarchy. It's kind of pro-monarchy. It's not Marxist, but casting black actors was considered radical, and radical equaled Marxist in the views of many. And so this is what was said at the time. Failing to appreciate the psychological complexity of Welles' overall adaptation, critics tended to see the show as a musical because there were African drums in between scenes, solidifying the fears of the Black Communist Party. People were afraid of blacks revolting, and the communists talked about revolt, so hence all black people who ever wanted to write at all must be socialist or communist. The word amusing keeps popping up in their reviews, a word not usually applied to Shakespeare's Macbeth, which indeed is a tragedy. It was seen as something unserious to do with Shakespeare. I don't think it was unserious. I think he was very serious in his adaptation and not meaning to in any way mock the play or the players. This was a legitimately surprising children's theater play called The Revolt of the Beavers. I think today that sounds super funny. Um, uh, but here is what was going on. This was brought before Congress as an example of what was wrong with the Federal Theater Project, as it was just this hotbed of communism. And Oakleaf is a beaver in exile, and he says, the chief has a big gang, but don't you worry, Professor. Someday the beavers will get sore. They'll want to do something very big against the chief. I guess there was an oppressive police officer in this play. I hope you will not think me less of a professor if I tell you I have never read the entire script of Revolt of the Beavers. And there were also um, these things that they called living newspapers. They would perform the news of the day live in local areas. And they were worried about this because communists and during the revolution did this in Russia. They'd go to farm communities and have people act out the news. And it was, as I said, a topical form of theater based on headlines. And yeah, the guy who was directing the FTP Living Newspaper Project was indeed a communist. And he was influenced by Bertolt Brecht's ideas. I will explain Brecht to you. One thing you'll notice from the interview with Arthur Miller is how dry he is. By which I mean he is not given to overstating things. A dramatic guy in any sort of like self-dramatizing kind of a way. And this is Bertolt Brecht, who really needs to consult a different hairdresser. But he was a playwright in the 1930s that the Nazis absolutely frigging hated. Hitler hated this guy, and everybody who knew what he was up to in the Nazi party hated him. And he had this idea, and I will do it partial justice, Verfremdungseffekt. Verfremdungseffekt was a misguided idea. The playwright believed that theater ought not appeal particularly to the emotions of the audience. He wanted to educate them. So you should feel nothing when you see a play or a movie. You should just get educated in this sort of thinky way. The Nazis hated him, like I said, and he had to flee Germany and came to the U.S. about the time that there is a this federal theater project, and he saw theater as a tool for political empowerment of the masses. He wanted his audience, for instance, watching a play where a child was going hungry, not to weep for the sad child, but to ask the question intellectually. I can't resist using the German accent for Brecht, who I actually do admire. Why do children go hungry? And so he wanted you to think about it. He didn't want you to be sad. Brecht never really succeeded in divorcing theater from emotion, and to that I say, thank God. This said, his plays remain influential to this day. They truly do. The alienation effect, which is what Verfremdungseffekt means. Verfremdungseffekt influences Arthur Miller directly in his work. Miller said, without alienation, there can be no politics. So his play, Death of a Salesman, is not overly melodramatic in any way. It's restrained. And Brecht's possibly most famous play is called Mother Courage. And there's a woman who learns of the death of her child, and so they give her the bad news. And instead of actually screaming, which most actors would have thought to do, she simply stands silently screaming, miming it. And he thought this would make them have the Verfremdung effect. In other words, we would just say, ah, the woman is upset because her child died. Why do children die in factories? But instead, the audience wept even harder because it was like she was so sad. She couldn't let out a noise that was so much bigger than a scream. So, because she didn't weep, they did, which was the opposite of what Brecht wanted. I happen to think it's pretty good theater. I think the audience was right to cry. But Miller joins the FTP, the Federal Theater Project, in 1938 with Elia Kazan, who directs Death of the Salesman on the stage. And he talks about joining the theater project to get on the welfare roll. He had to get on the welfare rolls, and he had to be all but penniless in order to be eligible to be a penniless artist, to get a $23 a week job, which, if it doesn't sound like much money to you today, it was more money then, but and he is deeply influenced by the exciting group of artists' ideas in this place. Um, and here's what Helga Norman Nielsen says. During the period from the 1930s to the 40s, Marxism exercises a controlling influence on Arthur Miller's work. This is evident in several of his earliest unpublished plays, propaganda pieces advocating the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a socialist system. The same message is embodied in Death of a Salesman. After the war, there was a backlash against the WPA artists, because now that Hitler was defeated, the right wing in this country turned its eyes toward Russia and assumed that anybody who wanted there to be significant workers' rights and wrote about it, that they must be like Joseph Stalin, which was an alarmist falsehood. Republicans took over Congress. There was a worry that the Soviet Union was planning to take over the U.S. That might not have been entirely unfounded, but it was unlikely. They were more likely to take over Poland than the U.S. And Congress began fighting back against the people who had given voice to any pro-worker ideas, raise the minimum wage kind of ideas, conflating them with all totalitarians. Like, if you want to raise the minimum wage, you're Stalin, rather than respecting their First Amendment rights to free expression. Let me be abundantly clear about what those are. In this country, and it's one of the reasons I love it so much, you and I have the right to say stuff. We may not have the right to put it on YouTube if it's incredibly inflammatory, because YouTube is a private organization, but I can go in the street and I can buy a megaphone and shout it out in the street any crazy idea I happen to have. They can have ordinances about what time of day I can use the megaphone because people get to sleep, but I'm allowed to say literally anything and not get put in jail for it. Senator Joseph McCarthy wanted to put people in jail for saying stuff if it sounded communist to him. And that's not cool. And they were particularly, if I were looking for people to throw in jail because I thought another country was going to take us over, I don't think I would put the playwrights in jail first as like the people most likely to cause a military coup, because they write about, Willy Loman, a salesman. And so here are the people who had to go to Congress and justify what they were up to artistically. Arthur Miller, playwright Lillian Hellman, who writes a wonderful memoir about this called Scoundrel Time, if you can get a hold of it. And her plays are really cool. Elia Kazan, who kind of turns on everybody. He narcs on everybody so that he can keep directing in Hollywood. And while I love his movie Streetcar Named Desire, nobody loves a narc. Paul Robeson a black actor who was mostly associated with the communists because he was black and successful and wanted workers who were black to have rights. So, go figure. Dashiell Hammett, who wrote like these detective novels, Sam Spade. If you've ever seen Humphrey Bogart being a tough detective in an old black and white movie, that's Dashiell Hammett. He and Lillian Hellman had a really cool relationship. Dashiell Hammett got thrown in jail by Congress for being a communist. Uta Hagen, who is an actress and wrote a really good book, if you're an actor, called Respect for Acting. And then Orson Welles. Orson Welles didn't get thrown in jail, but he got investigated by the government. Why? He didn't break any laws. None of these people broke the law. What they were doing was saying what they thought. So where do we in this play? The setting is in Brooklyn, a neighborhood that's being overwhelmed by crowds and towers. Before us is the salesman's house. This is in the stage directions. We are aware of towering angular shapes behind it, surrounding it on all sides. The people in the house are threatened and overwhelmed by the tall buildings, symbols of the crushing power of those who win out in a capitalist struggle that has no room for failures and losers. The literary critic, Nielsen. And the man is at least as much for sale as the product. He himself has been valued as a monetary sum. I'm a dime a dozen. And this is the theater critic who loved the play says, Willie has always believed in something that is unsound. He does not seem to be much concerned about the quality of the product he is selling. His customers buy, he thinks, because they like him. The human is quantifiable monetarily rather than in terms of inherent human worth. That's a problem of capitalism, and I will say how big of a problem this is, particularly in New York. I've never heard this said anywhere else but in New York. But sometimes around Wall Street, one can hear people who work on Wall Street saying, when they want to say, how much does he have in money from his earnings? They'll say, how much is he worth? How much is he worth? How much is Willie Loman worth? He's a dime a dozen. The American dream cannot be all about money if it is to be the right American dream. Again, I'm not a communist, but I agree with that general sentiment. He had all the wrong dreams, all wrong. That's from the last scene. The insurance money usurps the family, any religious concerns, and even the basic biological will for self-preservation. Money is the god here. Death of a Salesman suggests that the right dreams, says Nielsen, are opposed to rapacious capitalism. Rapacious means the kind of capitalism that measures us all as if we were all in one big slave market. And that they are about justice, love, and genuine selfhood as envisioned by Marxism. I'm not sure that Marxism encompasses genuine selfhood, but that's largely the point that people make when they talk about this having Marxism. So why are these ideas controversial that we're more than what we earn, that we're more than what we can sell? Remember, it's produced in 1949. Eisenhower becomes president, and America, after World War II, has a capitalism that takes on a super earnestness. This is a factory in America after World War II. People think that rebuilding the nation after the war and the Depression is almost like a holy. And Americans were overwhelmed by the onslaught of production. Look up on YouTube Lucy and the Chocolate Factory. You'll see a very funny scene from an old comedy television series called I Love Lucy, where Lucille Ball can't pack all the chocolates fast enough at a chocolate factory, so she just starts eating them. And even something as formerly individual as a home was now produced en masse. This is a picture of Levittown, a neighborhood produced very quickly. Every house looks the same. The houses were consequently inexpensive compared to living in the city. Remember the cult of domesticity that we studied earlier. The cult of domesticity certainly wanted women to express individuality in their homes. There's very little individual in this aerial shot. This looks like the chocolates on the conveyor belt, doesn't it? Um, and instead of choosing who one would be, think of the transcendentalists, people increasingly define themselves by their purchases. Look at these old actual advertisements. Uh, they're drinking a chocolate milk called Ovaltine, and so they sing a song and they say, "We are the Ovaltinis." These children are defined by the chocolate milk they drink. This is the life, the rich way where I can save. Okay, it's a refrigerator. If your life is your refrigerator, we need to stage an intervention. And this ad on the right says, Christmas morning, she'll be happier with a Hoover. I just want to give you guys a heads up. If you're getting a present for a woman, uh, if you have a special someone in your life, even your mama, she'll not be happier with the vacuum cleaner than she would be by something else that came more from the heart. I didn't say, hey, why don't you get up and do some work? Why don't you vacuum the floor? Uh, but these were the messages the culture was sending to people about possession. Capitalism and patriotism got conflated during the Cold War, meaning rather than talking about saving the world for democracy, which is what people thought they were doing when fighting Hitler, people started talking about saving the world for capitalism. Now, democracy is something that our revolution was fought for. In no direct way does the Declaration of Independence talk specifically about capitalism. It talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not the pursuit of gold. Um, Here we see children who are being put in a drill in case somebody drops a bomb from Russia. Terrifying. And so suddenly, to champion the Willy Lomans of the world uh, was possibly to champion guys like Joseph Stalin, like I said before. Um, Willy Loman was not a communist, and Arthur Miller doesn't make him one. But he asks the question, doesn't his life need to be about more than selling stuff? And I think that that's a good question. And I hope the answer is yes for. And conservatives in this country use fear of communism to keep women out of the workforce. And what they said, Stalin made women work in the fields. We just gave them the opportunity to scrub floors with new mops at home. Better to have that Hoover for Christmas than to be a communist with a job. Kind of contradictory if you're working in a job you love. Um, uh, the civil rights movement was thought to be communist for no dang good reason other than the people who were black didn't want to be oppressed anymore. And Martin Luther King was investigated by the FBI to see if he had ties to the Soviet Union. Spoiler, he didn't. To prevent unions from effectively organizing on behalf of factory workers for things like on-site daycare centers. Again, why is that lady not at home with her kids like a good American? She's at work and her kid is in the daycare center where they have, I don't know, educational activities and snacks. She's a communist. By the way, on the right you see Marilyn Monroe with Arthur Miller. They were married for a while. She liked guys who could think. And it also, it prevented certain important American artists from producing work on stage, in movies, and on television, including for a time Arthur Miller. The play about recent productions on the 50th anniversary. Death of a Salesman continues to be produced internationally in China. I gave you a lecture about it from an Indian university. The guy who is the father of the guy who was my uncle's best man is the guy with the blonde hair in the white shirt. My family, like 2 degrees of separation from Arthur Miller. So why is it still being produced? People in the not too distant past were part of something called Occupy Wall Street. Google it if you don't know. And here's the questions that I think that this play addresses that are still relevant. Do we still struggle with how much money defines us? I think we do. Are we more for sale or less for sale than Willy Loman is in this 70-year-old play? Is our society more conformist or less conformist than the one that informed Willy's death? In some ways, way less. And in some ways, maybe more. Have we understood our humanity in more certain terms than did the generations that attended the opening night of this play? Are we really sure of ourselves as individuals? Do we consider consumer goods more than we should? When, if ever, will this play's concerns become irrelevant to American thinking? Anyone with college student loans may feel that he or she is a dime a dozen in the workforce. Does your generation face a crisis of overcapitalism? And if so, how will you overcome this problem? Again, I'm not a communist, but I am noticing that there are a lot of problems with capitalism right now that your generation is going to have to deal with. Global warming, from problems with mass production of plastics that destroy the oceans, automation of jobs so that they can pay yet less to produce a good or service. These are things that will affect your generation. I don't have answers. I know Willy Loman doesn't, but he's asking questions that are not irrelevant. Until Willy Loman's problems are truly past, Death of a Salesman can never